Okay, so we're at the home stretch of completing this last project for our jQuery course. And so let's just review quickly. We want to be able to click a listing to open up that listing's address in a new window in Google Maps. So that first part is something we know how to do. That is targeting the click of an element with the class of listings. So let's go ahead and do that. But remember, these elements with the class of listings are dynamically created. That means they are not there originally when the DOM loads. But we know how to get around that, because instead of targeting listings directly, we have to actually work targeting our document. So we're going to say document.on, this should look familiar, click, then our specific selector here, which is listings. Then we actually want to pass in a function. This function is going to be the code that we want to execute once that listing is clicked. And there's our basic anatomy. But now we need a way to target the specific apartment that was clicked, get its address, and then do something with that address. So there's a couple steps involved, but the first one's just kind of laying the groundwork. We need a way to have a unique identifier on this listing in order to work with it. A unique identifier most commonly would be an ID, because while classes may be repeated, IDs are supposed to be unique and only used once. So what I'm going to do is add an ID attribute to our listings element, and the ID, in order to make it unique, could be the same ID of the apartment that's being returned to us through JSON. So in this case, using concatenation again, all I'm going to do is say that the ID of the apartment, the ID of the HTML of the apartment is going to be the same as the ID of the apartment that's returned to us via JSON. So we're just going to say apartment.id. We're going to add that back. And make sure to put a space here before class, else this is going to all run in together and it's not going to be able to be parsed correctly. So now that we have that, let's move on to tackling our problem. We need to actually get the address of the listing that was selected. So fortunately, we know we have access to the address via the JSON that's being returned. But how do we get that here? Let's think about how we actually had access to the JSON originally. We had to use AJAX. In order to get properties that are on that apartment object, we need to actually use AJAX again here. But instead of targeting every element of the apartments array, we actually only are interested in the one that was clicked. So, knowing that, a good place to start is actually just copying and pasting this AJAX method that we used earlier into our code here. So let's go ahead and fix the formatting. So now we are going to use AJAX again. We're going to request to the same URL, but our success case is going to be different. We don't care about looping through every element of the array. We only care about the one that was clicked. So how are we going to do this? Well, let's return to our utility methods that we have available to us and see if we can find one that will only target the apartment, in this case, that meets our criteria. So returning to the documentation, I happen to already be there, but within the utilities is a method available to us called grep. So a lot of things here, and the name grep, I'm sure, is not intuitive unless you're familiar with it. But what grep does is finds the elements of an array which satisfy the filter function. So let's think about our filter function for a moment. Going back to our code, we now have a unique identifier on our apartment. So we basically want to target, we want to actually pull this ID out of the element that was clicked and compare it to the IDs of the apartments that are in the array. So our first step in doing this would actually be saving this apartment ID as a variable. So let's just make a variable called ID. And we already have access to the listing that was clicked. We know we can just say this. And just as we access the ID in the method above, or the function above, we have the ability to get the ID attribute off of that item. So we're going to do the same thing here to get the ID of the listing that was clicked. Awesome. So now back to grep. What grep does is actually, let's see an example here. Okay, so what we want to do in this case, grep accepts an array. So just as our each did as well, we are going to pass it the array of the apartments. And then in our function, we're only going to have to deal with the element that we want specifically. So in this case, the actual apartment. Here's a good example here. So our function, we're going to have access to each apartment element within the array. And what we want returned to us is the apartment that has the ID of the listing ID that was clicked. So let's go implement this. I think the easiest place to start would just be saving this selected apartment as a variable. So let's name the variable selected apartment. Okay, so now we're going to implement our grep method. So we're going to say jQuery.grep, and the first argument is going to be our array. So we know we have the same array here. We're going to use the response.apartments. And then in our function, we actually have access to each apartment element within the array. So we're going to use the same name as last time. We'll say apartment. And then within our code here, what we want returned to us in this case is the apartment ID, the apartment with the ID of the ID that was clicked. So basically what we're assessing is what apartment's ID equals the ID that we saved up here. So in that case, we're just going to say equals ID. And what this should return to us is a single apartment that matches our criteria. So let's go ahead and put a debugger statement and actually make sure we're being returned what we expect. So in order for debugger to work, we actually have to use the DevTools, open it up, and then I'm going to refresh the page. Now remember, our debugger should be hit when we click on one of these options here. So let's do that. Awesome. So now we're stopped within our success scenario, and let's see what this variable selected apartment actually returned. Okay, so we have an apartment object, I'm assuming. There we are. So we actually have an array element. We know it's an array element because we have these brackets here. And that array has one item in it, and it is the apartment object itself. So remember when we were talking about indexes of arrays? Well, we need a way to access the first and only element in this array. So selected apartment is an array, and it has one element inside the array. So how do we access that first element? We reviewed it when we were reviewing indexes, but we actually want to target the first index, and in this case, it's going to be 0. So now we have closer to what we want. We have our object itself. So now, thinking about what we actually want out of this object, we just need the address. That's all we actually need. So how do we access the address? Well, we've been doing this throughout this whole project. All we need to do is have the object itself, which is this selected apartment with the index of 0. And we can say .address. And there we have the actual address that we want to open in Google Maps. So going back to our code, now we actually want to work with that selected apartment in order to get the address. So let's make a new variable, and let's call it address. And we know how to access that address now. We're just going to use our selected apartment array, access the first element in it, and then call .address on that object. Awesome. So now that we have our address, we basically want to use that address for when this listing's clicked, open a new window with Google Maps to this specific address. So in order to do that, we can use something that's available to us via the browser in JavaScript. And we can open a new window by saying window.open. It's going to actually just open a new tab. And then we need to pass in the URL that we actually want to open. But what's the URL that we actually want to open here now? So we know we want to open Google Maps, but we need it to open to the specific address that's returned to us from our JSON. So how are we going to do that? Well, Google Maps makes things, and Google in general makes things tremendously easy to work with. So they have a lot of available information and documentation. But what I was able to find that I thought was helpful in this instance was a blog post from a developer who has listed out some of the query string parameters that Google Maps can take. So I just did a general Google search for this, and I've included it in the show notes. But so many of the problems that you need to solve as you go step by step throughout trying to accomplish your task in code, you're going to be Googling for, and you're going to have to learn to kind of filter those resources. So we focused a lot over this course of being able to ask the right question, identifying the behavior, and then looking for something that could kind of match that. So this was an example of something I did not know when I set out to do this task. But Googling around, you can easily find answers to the task that you want to accomplish. So this is helpful here because what they're actually saying is that Google Maps, at maps.google.com, you can pass a query string at the end of it like this. So this is pretty much what we want. We want to use a query string like this, and instead of saying something like New York, we just want to put the address that we were able to pull out from the JSON. So let's go ahead and copy this. Going back into our code here, that's what we're going to paste. And instead of New York, we're going to use concatenation to add our address. And let's go ahead and give it a shot. Back to the browser. We're here. We killed our debugger, so we can exit that. And here's to hoping that when we click this link now, it opens a new tab in Google Maps with this address. Awesome. So there we are. Now we can click through any of these to find the associated address in Google Maps somewhere. So that's it. Now we've used Ajax to target all of our elements, as well as using it to target a specific element that we needed access to information from.